Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the theobspod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter, anyone else that's interested, the theobspod is for you. Episode 62. Pandemic. Okay, I know. Everyone is so over the pandemic. But it's taken me this time to be able to reflect and think a little bit. And for me now feels like the right point to perhaps start talking about my experience of the pandemic. I think it's likely that this is going to need more than one episode, and I'll probably space them out a bit. There's a lot to be said. But today I'm going to attempt to give you a bit of a feel for what it's been like for me. I'm going to backtrack, start at the beginning. Early 2020. There's a virus in China. It's kind of in the news, it's vaguely on our radar, but we've all seen that before. Remember swine flu? Remember SARS? It never really came here. I know you'll all be with me when I say there was a time we were all in denial. Now imagine yourself in my shoes. You're a doctor. You've spent your whole life working in a hospital looking after people. Yes, to some extent, it is a vocational occupation. There's more to it than just the take-home paycheck at the end of the day. But it is a job. I have a defined role. I'm a doctor, but I've chosen a certain specialty. I'm an obstetrician. I deal with pregnant women. Suddenly, Italy happened. And we saw colleagues, and some of us knew colleagues, who were actually living that nightmare of people dying all over the place and doctors of any and every specialty being redeployed to try and do something to save them and being pretty helpless to do anything. Imagine that you're seeing that and realising that in a short space of time that could be you. That's pretty terrifying. I started to have an inkling that something terrible was going to happen. I rang my children, attempted to get them back from university. I was worried that if we got locked down, they would get stranded there. I don't think they really understood. I think they thought I was being an overprotective mother. The reality that actually, yes, this might happen here, this lockdown might come, really didn't enter their heads. My husband too kept saying it won't happen here. I was getting increasingly anxious. My family thought, oh, it's just because you're seeing things as a hospital doctor. You're getting slightly hysterical. You're panicking. It was a weird time. Then suddenly the whole country is frightened and everyone is pinning their hopes on you. And that's really difficult. You're as frightened and uncertain as everyone else. Yet you're supposed to know what to do, how to treat people, how to reassure people for a disease you've never encountered before. The whole country's entering a massive unknown. and you're at the forefront. You're no longer a doctor. You've become a soldier. You're fighting for the whole country. You're being put on a pedestal, but also there's suddenly an assumption you're willing to give your life for others. And that's not really how it seemed when I went to medical school. It wasn't about sacrificing myself for others. I felt angry. I felt scared that I'm supposed to put myself at risk and man the barricades. But equally, I felt selfish. As my parents put it, you're a healthcare worker, you're a doctor. Of course you need to do your part. And of course I did. We had conversations at work about, will it be like those posters, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? What did you do in the pandemic? We were very lucky. We had some time to prepare for the first wave, and one of our respiratory consultants ran some training sessions on what we knew of the disease so far. To be honest, that was pretty frightening. Looking at the CT scans and looking at what the virus could do to lungs, understanding that there was very little treatment we could do, apart from oxygen, some pretty appalling statistics on mortality, and then some practical advice on how to don and doff. These weren't even words we'd used before. How to put on and take off our protective clothing without contaminating ourselves and leaving ourselves open to infection. It seems totally insane now, but we were instructed to take off our clothes when we got home and put them in a bin bag and leave them either outside the house or in a porch or garage, shower as soon as we came through the door to try and avoid infecting others in our household. As I look back on it, it doesn't even seem real. But I can tell you for the whole first wave, that's what I did. I wore a single pair of trousers, came home, stripped off, kept them in a bin bag, away from the rest of my family. It was surreal. I was in this situation where I hadn't volunteered, but it was my duty. But I certainly didn't feel that my kids and husband deserved to be put at risk just because of my occupation. I would never live with myself if I brought infection home. Along with this, we all received a letter from our chief exec. This was a letter to allow us to travel, explaining that we were key workers and that we were exempt from staying home, that we could travel in and out of work. I printed it out, put it in my briefcase, had it ready with my ID badge to show. In some ways, I secretly hoped that I would get stopped and that I would be able to say, look at me, I'm key to all this. I am allowed out because I'm at the forefront of this work, this fight against disease. But in all the lockdowns we've had, I never had to show my letter. And I must admit to feeling slightly disappointed by that. In some ways, I wanted the challenge. I wanted to be seen as a valuable member of society. The next step in preparation was fit testing. Let me explain. For some patients with COVID who are going to have a general anaesthetic, we have to wear a much more complicated sort of mask that has to tightly fit round our mouths and noses and not leak. There was much consternation from some of my male colleagues that they needed to shave their beards or facial hair to allow the masks to fit. We were all told we needed to go for mask fit testing. This involved a trip to the basement underneath A&E, an area of hospital I have never been to, for a 15-minute appointment for a very bizarre process. We had to put on the mask, which was attached to a machine, and then we had to undertake a series of quite odd tasks. This involved walking on the spot, moving our head from side to side, moving our head up and down, and then, strangest of all, reciting a ridiculous paragraph about gold at the end of the rainbow. If we didn't pass, we had to retake it. The mask was attached to some sort of machine that was checking the seal. It was a lengthy process, and at that point really didn't feel like good use of my time. At the end of it, I passed. I'd been fit tested, and I was astonished when the woman testing then told me to dispose of my mask and put it in the bin. I could not comprehend how I'd had to have this extensive testing for a mask that then was disposed of. In actual fact, it was just to test what type of mask fitted my face, so that when I was going to use masks in other areas of the hospital, I should make sure that I was using that type of mask, that size, and that make. But it had never entered my head that I was going to do this very complicated mask testing and then just throw it away. Then there was the guidance. Oh my goodness, the guidance would drive a sane person mad. It was completely crazy. We had guidance coming at us from all directions. Public Health England, the WHO, NHS England, and then all interpreted by our individual hospital. Literally every time I went to work, the guidance was different. You would arrive and have no idea what was going on. One week, we were forbidden from wearing masks in the antenatal clinic. The next week, masks in antenatal clinic were compulsory. You had literally just grasped one piece of advice to be told, no, that one's gone. It was incredibly stressful and frustrating. An early question relevant to me was, can you use Entonox in labour? First of all, we were told no. Then, thankfully, relatively quickly, we were told, yes, we could. Initially, we made a cohort area. This was a sensible idea, keeping all women who may have COVID in a separate area. But bizarrely, this meant cleaning out offices and rooms, which in the end meant my office for 2 suddenly had 4 or 5 people hot desking, leaving us more cramped than ever before. The idea of a cohort area was good. You'd group patients together and staff would not move between areas, so that you'd have a set number of staff to look after COVID women and a set number of staff to look after the non-COVID women. If you were going between areas, you would have to completely change your clothes between the two. The first few shifts were really difficult. People were scared. People didn't want to go and work on the COVID cohort area. We took it in turns. Several shifts I went to the COVID ward to see women because I didn't feel I could ask my junior colleagues to go. I wanted to protect them. After all, they were younger than me. They had more to lose. One of the early shifts, I got completely stuck in the cohort area in the doffing room. That's where you take off your protective clothes, protective equipment. I'd got changed, ready to leave, stripped off, only to discover there were absolutely no scrubs to change into. I had to get redressed and go back out to the midwifery station and phone the labour ward and tell them that I was now trapped in the COVID area and ask them to bring me some clothes. I didn't even have my phone, name badge or pen because we were told not to take them into the wards with COVID, but to leave them outside. Bear in mind this was difficult. Initially we had no test. Then we had a test that took 6 or 7 days to come back. So we had to just treat people as if they had COVID. It was a long time before we had a reliable test with a short turnaround time. Remember that goal of 100,000 tests a day? I remember in the run-up to that, we were suddenly told to test everybody, regardless of symptoms. And then, we hit the target, but almost immediately, the South West London lab ran out of reagent. Alongside all this complexity, there were high levels of sickness because staff were off. Every day coming in, you wouldn't know how many midwives or how many of your medical colleagues would be off. And they may be off because they were ill, or they may be off because they just couldn't have a test we didn't know. So initially, we lost people for up to 2 weeks for anyone that had a cough or a temperature, or anyone whose child or anyone else in their family had either. This was very difficult. We were constantly covering for colleagues. So in some ways, it was a relief when we completely ditched our rota and made a totally different rota with extra staffing. We had to redeploy quite a number of our junior doctors over to the main part of the hospital. They would come back telling us tales of very difficult shifts on the COVID ward. To some extent, I was lucky working in maternity. Yes, I saw quite a lot of women with COVID and some who were very seriously ill, but I never had to face the depths of despair that were seen on the medical wards and in intensive care. I was spared that. Everything became 6 times more difficult. For everything, you had to consider what PPE you were going to wear, what levels for what procedures, with constant debate initially about what was and what wasn't an aerosol generating procedure for which we should wear the highest level of protection. We use something called diathermy when we're operating, electrical cautery. And initially we were told it was fine to use it. Then we were told, no, we shouldn't. Then we were told, yes, we can use it again. Very confusing trying to do what is already a complex job with a lot of decision making in a context where you're suddenly having to add in a whole nother layer of thinking that you've never encountered before. We were very lucky. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists produced some excellent guidance very early on. When they produced it, I thought it was extremely odd to produce such guidance over a weekend on a disease about which we knew almost nothing. But the guidance has been a godsend. We're now on version 13. It's updated every time there's new information. And it was fantastic because I could direct women to the website knowing that whenever they looked, they would be gaining the most up-to-date information. I'm still directing people there now, although the queries are mainly about vaccine. People are still clutching for advice, despite people being able to ask their GPs or local vaccination centres. I get numerous queries week in, week out about, can I have the vaccine? Not just from pregnant women, but from women that we've cared for in the past. I had this complication in my pregnancy 5 years ago. Can I have the vaccine? I'm still breastfeeding my baby. Can I have the vaccine? If I'm going to have the vaccine, which vaccine would you recommend? I've been astonished at the number of queries we've had. But in some respects, guidance can have its own problems. The Royal College of Radiologists had different guidance than the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and this led to endless friction. We had a very difficult time where the sonographers and radiologists would not allow partners into ultrasound rooms. So we were in this very confusing situation where a couple could come in for a consultation in the antenatal clinic, come into my consulting room and see me or the midwife. But if they went for a scan of the same pregnancy in the same department, the partner would not be allowed to go into the room. It felt horribly wrong. But there was a massive amount of internal wrangling about it. The maternity department doesn't manage or employ the sonographers. The sonographers were going by their professional college's guidance. Who are we to disagree with that? But it wasn't very joined up thinking, and it led to some very difficult situations for women with their partners sitting outside ostracised in the car, waiting for news. Don't get me wrong, there have been some fantastic silver linings. Our thriving home birth rate, after the initial glitch where the ambulance couldn't support conveying in an emergency, we've gone from strength to strength, with more women seeing home as a viable option because they don't want to come into hospital. We've also introduced some phone appointments and video appointments using Attend Anywhere. This can be very beneficial for women. They don't have to come to hospital and see us. Although I must admit, perhaps I'm a little old-fashioned, but I do like a face-to-face consultation. I find it difficult to make a clinical assessment and talk to the woman and read her body language and communication if she's not in front of me. But at least it gives us options. Maternity felt like a strange part of the hospital. For us, it was very much business as usual with COVID as an add-on. Whilst many other specialties completely shut down and were redeployed or almost completely transformed into phone or video appointments, we always were seeing women face to face throughout. Sometimes I can forget how lucky I am that through the whole pandemic, I have been able to go into my workplace. I've been able to see women, families, do my job, talk to my work colleagues, have a cup of coffee with someone, have a corridor conversation. I'm extremely lucky to be able to do that. I do realise many people have had to work in isolation at home for a very long time. And even using Teams or Zoom, on the occasion that I do have to have a meeting using the technology, I can't imagine how people sit at it day in, day out. We were in a hilarious situation at the beginning of the pandemic where we were supposed to switch to Teams for all our meetings, but actually none of the hospital computers had cameras, and many of them didn't have working microphones. It took months before we got into a situation where we could reliably say we were going to have a camera and a microphone. Many of our meetings in the first instance were cancelled, of course, as we put anything other than face-to-face clinical work and emergency stuff on hold. As we gradually reintroduced some of the normal day-to-day, such as training and risk meetings and guideline production, we could end up in really quite stupid situations where we weren't allowed to have more than 4 people together in a room at a time. So we undertook some meetings with 2 of us in one office and 2 people down the corridor in another office, socially distanced, of course. And we were in this idiotic situation where we'd have technical problems, where we couldn't manage to screen share correctly, or we couldn't hear what the people in the other room were saying properly. And it would have almost been easier to open the door and shout down the corridor than to use the technology in front of us. We were simply just so behind at a technological level. Equally, another of the major silver linings from my perspective has been the ability to do electronic prescriptions for outpatient drugs and get them delivered to a pharmacy close to where the woman lives. That has been revolutionary. Such a simple thing, so beneficial, so straightforward, and yet only allowed because of COVID. But to round off, I want to, in today's zesty bit, think about why I'm talking about the pandemic now. I don't know if you've heard of the campaign Buy Pregnant Then Screwed, #ButNotMaternity. Initially, this obviously made some sense. As things eased a bit last summer, people started to be able to go out to eat, perhaps go to the pub, even attend an event, catch up with friends. And yet women were still giving birth unsupported or attending their scans or appointments alone. I struggled with this campaign because we worked very hard at my hospital to keep birth partners present throughout a woman's labour or admission. It was really sad that the most frequent question I was asked in antenatal clinic is, will I be allowed a birth partner? Will my partner be able to attend throughout my labour? Will I need to be a certain number of centimetres dilated? Because that's been very publicly published in the newspapers, some restrictions that some hospitals are applying. And will I be able to have my partner with me on the postnatal ward? The thing is, the pandemic, we certainly hope, is on the wane. We're coming out of restrictions. And yet, almost every day, I see a devastating, sad, poignant thread from some woman who's maybe in preterm labour or going for a scan, who's been denied the ability to have her partner with her. Or I see on Twitter comments from partners that they're still being excluded from their partner's care. And when you look at these threads, people pile on. Some of them pile on to say, of course, that's not how it is in my maternity unit. Why is that? Challenge them. These are the options. These are the things you can do. But equally, numerous people pile in with their own stories of their maternity care during the pandemic, being alone, being frightened, being not allowed to have the people with them that they need for their support in this very vulnerable, very important moment in their lives. Being hospitalised and not being able to have visitors. Being separated from loved ones. And the thing is, it's still going on. And the reason I chose to do this episode this week is I've seen a number of threads this week on this very topic. And it isn't just a nicety. This potentially is going to result in problems for these families for years to come. Difficulty perhaps bonding with their unborn baby for a partner who's been excluded. Mental health problems or trauma for a woman who has felt unsupported and that she can't have her partner with her because of a set of rules we've imposed. And the really scary thing is the inconsistency. We're living in the same country with the same levels of infection and the same government restrictions, and yet the rules, I even hesitate to call them rules, are different for every maternity unit, so that you could, in one trust, be able to be with your partner throughout, and in the neighbouring trust, not be able to be present at all. And I've been told by some of our local doulas that this is the case. So the zesty bit today is, if you're still in a hospital or maternity unit where you're limiting the woman in terms of having a birth partner with her at her time of need, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Challenge that. If it's not your say-so, but it's the instructions of someone else, challenge that. Because it's not right. It really isn't. And a year and a bit into this pandemic, it's time we put a stop to it. If you're a pregnant woman or partner listening to this, do you know what the restrictions, if there are some, are at your maternity unit? Find out in advance what you will and won't be able to do. And if you have a choice and you're not happy with the arrangements, challenge them ahead of time. Or think, can you switch hospitals? Is that an option for you? I know in some more rural areas it just isn't possible. But know what you're up against and use the campaign to try and help not only yourself but others following you on their maternity journey, so that we put an end to this ridiculous situation. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the theobspod. Feel free to contact me on Twitter at FW or at theobspod to ask me questions, give me topics for future episodes, or let me know what you think. It's absolutely fantastic when you get in touch. I really enjoy reading your comments. As usual, I've tried to include in the programme notes some extra reading about this particular topic, both for professionals working in maternity care and for pregnant women using services. I'd like to reassure you that although I'm talking about my experiences working in maternity care, I take confidentiality very seriously and do not give any personal information about any of my patients. If you've enjoyed listening, I'd love you to recommend the theobspod to friends or colleagues, and please do leave me a review on whichever podcast directory you find my episodes. Many thanks for listening.